Well, begin recording. So there's a selection from Paley in your text, but this is what I'm displaying is what's in supplemental readings in that subfolder. Paley calls his book Natural Theology. Again, there are questions about whether we can prove the existence of God just from observations of nature. In other words, if there were a divine creator, could we find evidence for that conclusion just simply by looking at nature? These arguments are a posteriori. That is, they are based on experience. They're not like the ontological argument that was a priori, that was prior to and independent of experience, that went just from the concept of God to a claim about God's existence. So here's a quote from Natural Theology, and it's an interesting book. I once had a very old 1800s copy that I bought at a used bookstore, and it, unlike a lot of works in philosophy, it has a lot of line drawings about parts of plants and animals, where Paley is basically making the same point over and over about the way these plants and animals have various organs, various parts that are like the watch. Now this was quoted in the video I showed. Paley says, in crossing a heath, which is like a field, he's in Britain, so. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be there. He says, I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. In other words, there's no problem in thinking, well, just the forces of nature came together to make it such that this stone happens to be in this place at this time. But think about yourself. Suppose you're walking across campus, and some of you don't know this who are from out of town, but it's only been recently that they planted a lot of grass in the quad. For years, it was just, covered with stones and concrete. I like the way it looks now. They did a good job on it. But at any rate, suppose you're walking across a part of campus and you look down and you see, okay, there's some pebbles there, and some twigs and some blades of grass. And you wouldn't have any problem thinking, well, okay, all of these are here due to the forces of nature. But suppose along with that you saw a ballpoint pen lying there on campus. Think about it. You wouldn't say to yourself, well, isn't this interesting? In this place, besides there being some sticks and stones and twigs and blades of grass, and at this time of the year leaves, the forces of nature have come together to produce a ballpoint pen. How wonderful. No, you wouldn't say that, would you? You'd say, well, somebody must have dropped it, or maybe it's out of ink and they just threw it away. And Paley does the same thing. He says, but suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. He says, I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. In other words, he wouldn't say, hey, look, watch might have been here for 1,000 years, just like the stone, and it would have been just produced by the forces of nature. So Paley asks a rhetorical question here. He says, yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? And here's where we get into where Thomas Aquinas had gone. The fact that things in nature seem to serve various purposes, just like things that we make, manufactured, humanly manufactured, designed and manufactured objects, like this ballpoint pen, like a watch. He says, yet why should not the answer serve for the watch as well as the stone? And Paley answers, he says, why is it not as admissible an answer in the second case as in the first? So he answers his own question. And by the way, when you're writing, and I didn't get much of this, but some students like to, it's okay to ask a rhetorical question, maybe even two in a row, but some people like to argue their own case by asking half a dozen rhetorical questions in a row and putting it on their reader to fill in their argument. You want to state your position, your argument positively, not just ask a bunch of rhetorical questions. Okay, back to this. So Paley, after giving us two rhetorical questions, answers. He says, for this reason and for no other, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. Now, they're adjusted to produce motion. Now, here's something you need to cultivate, especially since you're in your college years and you're reading some difficult things, right? Readings at a college level. One of the things you need to sort out as you're reading stuff is what are the more important points that are made here and what is just background material supporting those points. Well, what Paley goes into from here, and I haven't looked at the, I think this part is also in your text, is a long description, more than you and I ever want to read, about the inner workings of an old tick-tock watch, how the gears and springs work together. Remember, Paley's book comes out in 1802. There aren't any digital watches around in 1802. There's only the old kind of with the gears and springs and what have you. But all this information in this paragraph just supports the basic claim that the watch has parts that work together to serve a purpose. That is, to move the hands so we can use it as an implement for telling time, right? Now, I like the way I selected things because of the next page, which is not in your book. Well, okay, no, actually, before this, and I'm not going to read through these, Paley goes off and tries to anticipate some objections. Remember we said that one good thing to do in a paper is to do a preemptive strike and say, well, here's my thesis, and it might be objected against what I've argued in this paper that blah, 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 blah. But here's my answer to blah, 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 right? In other words, it's frequently a good practice to try to bolster the argument you made in your paper by anticipating some objections. And that's what Paley does with some of these and I'm not going to read them because I want to move on here. So, in chapter 6, remember, we were just in chapter 1, where he gets out the first part of the analogy, but it really isn't until later that he makes it very clear what the conclusion is. Now, an argument from analogy is not like the ontological argument, which is a deductive argument that is so logically tight that if the premises are true, it guarantees the truth of the conclusion. That's what we call a valid deductive argument. In other words, in that kind of an argument, it would be a contradiction to accept that the premises are true and yet deny the truth of the conclusion. And that was the claim, both of Anselm and Descartes, that if the fool accepts the premises of the ontological argument, the fool being the denier of God, and denies the conclusion, then they end up in contradictions. It's not the same with a statistical argument, a probabilistic argument. And there are many types of probabilistic arguments, what are called inductive, not deductive arguments. And one of those types of arguments is an argument from analogy. What you're saying in an argument from analogy is roughly this. Okay, here are two things, A and B, and A and B have various similarities that we can observe, right? So those are the premises of your argument. Point out a similarity or basic similarities, right? And so the way you proceed from there is to say, well, could it be that they're similar in another respect that is not as obvious? Take something like a watch. We already said it has parts that work together to serve a purpose. Now, the idea is, are there things in nature that have parts that are intricately put together and seem to work together to serve a purpose? Okay, I'll tell you.
Just reading it, he's basically saying that even us as humans, we have our own parts that work together quickly. Our hormones tell us, our reaction tell us what's going on, and then our organs work together, our heart and our brain work together to keep the heart beating. And then our lungs bring in the air, which will help us pump all the oxygen to our body. It's basically saying that even though if we cannot say, well, there's not a feeder, if you don't look at everything from a perspective that's outside of your eye, then you are going to believe from what you see. And seeing how everything works into accordance with the plants, and how there's a field mouse and everything goes up into a correlation of a course of that triangle of who's on top and who's on the bottom. Everything was together. Even the bottom, which is the plants, they eat off of the dead of the top, and it'll keep going back in circles, saying that even though that you cannot say that it's not, if you look at everything with your eye instead of trying to be outside of it. Basically, to the conclusion that there is no way to intelligently say that that's not a creator.
Well, you've got basically, where the argument goes. In other words, see what Paley says, because I think your authors, I may even write them saying, hey, you guys should have included this part, because here's where he drives the analogy home. No, Paley says in chapter 6, we were just in chapter 1, every observation which was made in our first chapter concerning the watch may be repeated with strict propriety concerning the eye, concerning animals, concerning plants. And I said I had a copy of Paley's Natural Theology that I bought at a used bookstore from the early 1800s. And it's an interesting book to look through because there are a lot of line drawings with pen of various organs of plants and animals that where he basically makes the same point over and over again that he's making here. So he says all the organized parts of nature. Now, note what he says in 6, where there Paley really thinks the eye is a particularly good example of design to use for his argument. He says, were there no example in the world of contrivance? Contrivance here is basically a synonym for design, for intelligent design. Were there no example except that of the eye? He says, it would be alone sufficient to support the conclusion which we draw from it as to the necessity of an intelligent creator. Now, is that a typo that the word creator in the middle of a sentence is capitalized, or is he trying to imply something there?
He's trying to find something.
Yeah.
I believe that he's
And what's he trying to imply?
I believe
That, yeah, right, that the creator with a capital C refers to God, just like God with a capital G.
If it's a pronoun, not just like a noun, I think that he's trying to give it like the actual personality that it's an actual person. Like he's not saying, oh, well, this is the creator, just like a noun. No, he's saying this is the creator.
Yeah, he uses a more neutral term, right? So you see how the argument goes. You'd say, well, okay, here are two things. Let's say it's the watch and the eye. And they both have similarities in that they both seem to have intricate parts that work together to serve a particular purpose or function. With the eye, it's enabling us to see. With the watch, enabling us to tell time. So then, for your conclusion, you say, but wait a second. The watch didn't just get that way. It had to have been planned and designed and by an intelligent mind. So then you would say, well, could it be that probably the works of nature, which show similarities to the watch, have this additional similarity that just as the watch needed an intelligent designer, so did the works of nature. And again, who would be the designer of the eye other than God himself? So that's how the argument goes. And you saw basically how that is. Now, what I wanted to do, and there's more there, but again, some of this is the same kind of stuff. In fact, I don't know why I cut all that out, but that he did with the watch. He goes into all kinds of intricate detail about how the parts of the eye work together.
If you don't have anything else to do, can I read that like before you close it? Can I read it?
Read what?
Yeah. That whole passage.
Oh. Well, I can leave.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I want to transition though to the PowerPoint because but it's there. That whole thing is there in supplementary readings in Blackboard. So again, let me remind you all now that everybody's here that I'm going out of town for the weekend. I'm leaving after my Thursday night classes, not returning until Sunday night. So there's going to be an assignment in Blackboard as a make-up assignment. It'll probably have something to do with what we're studying now. But Monday, we'll be here. But this afternoon, I'm going to try to get your term paper there. So, David Hume was, throughout his life, very skeptical philosopher, not just about religion, but about the ability of philosophy to support its claims in a lot of other areas. He said we should be skeptical about the existence of the material world, our own existence as a continuous person, the existence of regular and predictable laws of nature, and a number of other things besides God that Hume tried to give skeptical arguments against. Now, Hume tried to get an academic appointment but wasn't able to, because unlike things are today, the people who controlled the universities in Scotland were pretty devout Christian believers. And they knew where Hume was coming from and didn't think he would fit into the program very well. So when Hume was a young man, in his mid-20s, he wrote a very controversial book, at least one he intended to put himself on the map with. Because remember, nobody knew who he was. He's a young person, not much older than you all. And he writes a book called A Treatise of Human Nature, trying to say that a lot of the views philosophers defend cannot be defended by reason, are not believed on the basis of reason, but simply on the basis of our human nature and their belief for irrational reasons having to do with custom and feelings, not with reason. So he wrote a friend after the treatise came out that the book was stillborn from the presses. In other words, he really wanted to make a splash with it, and nobody paid any attention to it, or to him. And so at any rate, though, since he couldn't get a university appointment, one of the things he did was take a job as a librarian, and he used that to research and write what turned out to be the standard history of England for years. You could still see him occasionally in a used bookstore, and it's something like 10 or 12 volumes, and it's about 3 or 4 foot wide, a huge, ponderous thing that gave him real literary fame. Plus, he wrote some other works in philosophy. So here is Hume at the end of his life. He's been diagnosed with the same ailment that his mother had and died of, which probably was stomach cancer. So he knows that his days are numbered. And here at the end of his life, he didn't have to prove anything to anybody. He's gained worldwide fame. He's got a book called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Here, natural religion, natural theology, those phrases, you can use them interchangeably. And he knows it's going to be very controversial. Hume, at this point in his life, doesn't want to deal with a lot of firestorm of criticisms about this book. So he instructs his publisher not to publish it until after his death, which the publisher does. And Paley writes after Hume, and some people think Paley never read Hume, but he did. There's internal evidence. But we're not going to get to Hume's criticisms of the design argument, which, by the way, of 3 things he wanted to be remembered for, this was one of the 3, what he thought was his destruction of the design argument. Now, obviously, even today, not everyone agrees that David Hume did that. But So Hume's going to write against the design argument as a bad analogy, and as one with a number of possible conclusions. But before he does this, remember we said that one good practice in writing an essay or a term paper is, if you're going to write on a particular topic, summarize it first. Let people know, let readers know how you understand. And this does two things. It brings them up to speed in the issue you're discussing, letting them know how you understand it. But it also lets people say, well, okay, did he or she get it right? Do they understand what they're writing on or misunderstand it? And this is what Hume does. Most philosophy is not written like Plato's dialogues in dialogue form. Most philosophy is just written in prose form, where the arguments are just set out, by the author. But David Hume chose to make this a discussion, a dialogue between three people. And we'll look at that in more detail. Hume is a character in the dialogue. His name is Philo, and he is the skeptical philosopher. There's another person who we'll see mentioned later called Damia, who's a very simple, straightforward, conservative religious believer. But then there's Cleanthes, who wants to believe in a God with human attributes like benevolence and mercy and intelligence, but who is a more intellectual believer. He wants his faith not just to rest on, say, what the Bible says or miracles, but he wants more rational grounds for his faith. So it's Cleanthes who gives us the design argument in Hume's dialogues. But this is Hume's way of summarizing it. He said the world, which he really means the universe, is like a big machine. People even talked of the clockwork universe. After Newton, they thought the laws of the universe and the planets move in such regular orbits. It's like the whole universe is a big mechanism, clockwork mechanism. It says the world is a machine subdivided into an infinite number of smaller machines, like the parts of plants and animals. And he says all these little machines and their parts are admirably and accurately adjusted to one another. Basically, adjusted to one another, why? So that these parts can serve particular purposes. So he says throughout nature, things like eyes and ears and parts of plants, means, the way the eye is constructed, say, are adapted to ends, the ability for the eye to serve the purpose of, conveying visual information to the brain, enabling us to see. Means are adapted to ends in ways that resemble yet exceed the products of human design, like a watch or a pen, or as Hume later says, like a ship or a house. So here you've got the similarities. And so he says, if the products of design are similar, whether it be something like a watch or an eye, in having parts that work together to serve purposes, by analogy, he says the causes must be similar. That is, if man-made objects like ships and houses needed intelligent designers, then why wouldn't the products of nature need an intelligence if they're similar. So the author of nature, here again, note the word author and nature are capitalized, which is another way of referring to God, the God of monotheism. So the conclusion is that God must be an intelligence like human intelligence, but that God has, when he says larger faculties, that God is a much greater mind than our mind, since the products of divine design, like eyes and ears, are much grander and brains than the products of human design, like watches and ships. So the conclusion of the design argument is not only that God exists, but that God is an intelligent being and has an intelligence like human intelligence. So again, what's going on here is Hume is summarizing this argument to later criticize it, not to argue for it. But he's trying to bring his readers up to speed in what the design argument is all about if they're unfamiliar with it. So we'll look next week at Hume's criticism of the design argument. So